Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I wanted to have a quick chat about a book that I saw and read last night. And just about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, lounging on my couch. I wanted something nice and light, and I remembered that I had picked this up recently. And I saw it on somebody's channel here on BookTube, but just who it was has slipped my mind. But if it was you who talked about this book recently, thank you. I'm sorry I'm forgetting who you are. But this is I guess it would be a middle grade book. It's for ages, 9 to 12 or 13. But it's by Kate Albus and it's called A Place to Hang the Moon. And the reason I picked this up is because it's in some ways a tribute to children's literature of the 30s and the 40s. And hearing a review of it, it certainly intrigued me because it reminded me of, the Enid Blyton books that I loved so much growing up. And I heard that there was also, some callbacks to a lot of early children's literature from that era and from even earlier as well. And so it intrigued me because the plot is essentially about three children, Edmund, Anna, and I think the third one's name is William. Yep, William, Edmund, and Anna, who are sent away into the English countryside to avoid the bombings in London during the Second World War. But theirs is not exactly a typical story. Rather than being sent away by their parents, they are sent away by their grandmother's solicitor, because the scene opens with the funeral of their grandmother. The three are orphans. Their parents have died years before. And rather than putting them into the system, and you can't expect that the system looked very good in 1940s Britain at all. Certainly it would have been better than some places in the world at that time, but it's still, it's not great today, and it certainly wasn't great in the past. And it's quite likely that these children would have been, split up and fostered out to different families. So instead of putting them into the system, the solicitor makes these arrangements with the help of their housekeeper, the housekeeper who is the most likely figure to take the role of a mother in their life, although even then she doesn't seem to have much of a motherly role. With the help of the housekeeper, the solicitor sends them off with a local day school to this rural community where they are taken on as boarders. And they're with all these other evacuee children. Most of these children already know each other. And there's, daily school, even though it's summer. They end up in a couple of different houses. Not always the kindest people they meet in this small town. There's a lot of prejudice and a lot of name calling and some very unpleasant incidents. But all three children are bookworms, and so as soon as they get into town, they discover the local library and the local librarian, who becomes a good friend of theirs. And the local librarian has a bit of a secret. She's suspected in some ways of being a sympathizer, not because of any of her own actions, but because of who she married. And so you have these three children who have been sent off by the solicitor, and the solicitor has suggested to them that they should be looking for a mother. They should be looking for a parent figure. They should look for a family that, once they reveal it to them, will eventually want to adopt them. But he says, don't do it right away, because someone might take advantage of you for your money. And it is a little bit of an absurd setup. Just the fact that the solicitor would be like, go off, find yourself some parents. But one, it is a children's book. And so from a children's perspective, that would be, I think, quite an interesting idea. It would make complete sense to a child. I know I would have enjoyed this concept in middle school. But on the other hand, the book is set in a fairly unstable time. And so it actually seems like a completely reasonable response just to send these children off with a bunch of other children who are being evacuated, because they're going to get that temporary home that perhaps would have been very, very difficult to find in London. Although it is a bit odd they didn't involve the authorities, but I guess, in wartime, whatever version of, child and family services they had back then probably were a little bit preoccupied and not looking in on these wealthy children. But I want to say I was pleasantly surprised, but not pleasantly surprised, because I thought it was going to be really good. And I was pleased in the fact that it was really good, because we start right off from the bat with callbacks to some of my favorite childhood works. We of course have references to Enid Blyton, but from the start, Anna is reading A Little Princess by Frances Hodgins Burnett. And that was one of my favorites as a child, although I don't know if I read the full book as a child. I think I might have just read the abridged, but I was absolutely in love with the Shirley Temple adaptation, which does have something of a twist on the end. In the Shirley Temple adaptation, they decide that the father is actually alive in the end. He didn't die. Rather, he's just had amnesia until the moment when, with the help of Queen Victoria, Shirley Temple once again finds her father in a hospital. But that aside, so we've got Anna reading A Little Princess, and I'm just going to flip to the back here because it's very nice. They put a recommended reading list in the back for anyone who reads this. And the Enid Blyton book that's recommended here is actually something called The Enchanted Wood. And I know I never read that as a child, and it was probably just because it wasn't in my particular public library system. I spent most of my time reading and rereading the adventure series, the Castle of Adventure, the Sea of Adventure, the Valley of Adventure, which it does have something of a similar premise to this book. It's one of those, British schoolboy novels, so to speak, or schoolgirl novels, where the children leave their boarding school, leave the city, and are sent to the country where they have adventures. And as I said, A Little Princess, but we've got Agatha Christie in here as well. The librarian recommends Murder on the Orient Express to the one boy. The one kid is, when they go off into the country for the first time, he packs The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas, which was one of my favorites as a teenager. We've got Wind in the Willows. One that I didn't recognize was a book by Norman Hunter titled The Incredible Adventures of Professor Brainstorm, which I hadn't read. They're reading the Yellow Fairy book, which reminded me that that's kind of a gap in my own childhood reading. I never had any of Andrew Lang's fairy books. And it got me thinking, maybe that could be kind of fun to dig into those fairy books and read all those fairy tales that so many people in my generation grew up reading. It was certainly very popular in the 90s and the early 2000s to go into someone's, bedroom or playroom or nursery and just see a whole row of the fairy books of the different colors all lined up. And then, Winnie the Pooh, Anne of Green Gables. Anna says something at one point about how it's interesting how there's so many children's books about orphans, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, given this is a children's book about orphans. The Hobbit, Mary Poppins, and it's kind of nice, kind of neat how so many of the books they're reading end up mirroring, from a child's perspective, the own events in their life, this experience of being up against adversity, being orphaned, and there's even this beautiful little scene where they're in this one billet with this woman who's got a whole bunch of children, not really enough money to take care of those children, or the three of them that she's taken in for the money, and they're cold, they're hungry, they're wet, and Anna decides to tell a story from her copy of The Little Princess about when the two children, Sarah and I'm forgetting the name of the other girl right now, but when Sarah and her friend are asleep in their beds, and I can picture it from the Shirley Temple adaptation. Sarah and her friend are asleep in their beds, and they're dreaming that everything's warm, that they've got warm slippers, warm blankets, and that their cold, drafty attic with the rats, has become this beautiful warm palace with lots of food and a roaring fire. And the children are sort of getting into this until Anna mentions that, well, then Sarah and her friend wake up and it's all real because, it's not magic. She gives away that spoiler too. It's not magic, but it's all real because a neighbor has looked in and seen them and snuck in to give them this grand surprise. And so they're imagining that, and it does have quite a happy ending, as you would expect from a children's book. But I think if you're a fan of, Enid Blyton or anything from that era, that kind of children's literature, this would be a really fun one for you to dig into and just relax and enjoy, because I certainly enjoyed the hour and a half, 2 hours I spent with it last night.